The Andromedan's piercing shrieks were muffled by the wet ripping of his hardened exoskeleton, green ichor splattering across the dingy bar as the vicious cricket he called a pet tore into his thorax, the alien learning far too late not to underestimate the creature's true nature. Scott Johnson, a grizzled veteran space marine drowning his sorrows in cheap liquor, trying to forget the horrors he'd witnessed in the war, sat motionless at the bar. His cold, assessing eyes watched the scene unfold. Around him, the other patrons, humans and aliens alike, scattered in terror, but not Scott. He knew this was the inevitable result of the Andromedan's arrogance. Thules the Andromedan had burst into the bar moments earlier, his exoskeleton gleaming under the dim lights. He dragged a leashed cricket behind him, a snarling, six-legged beast with razor-sharp fangs, native to the deadly jungles of Rigel 7th. Thule had roughly yanked the creature's leash, forcing it to heel, then swaggered up to the bar, demanding sustenance for himself and his pet. The Andromedan's superiority complex was well known, but openly referring to such a vicious predator as a mere pet was a new level of hubris. And now, as Thule thrashed and screamed on the grimy floor, his lifeblood pooling beneath him, the folly of that arrogance was laid bare for all to see. Scott knew this incident could spark a dangerous confrontation between humans and Andromedans. The aliens already viewed humans as weak and sentimental for caring about lower beings. They would surely use this as an excuse to tighten their grip on humanity's throats. But Scott also knew that underestimating the strength and will of those seen as inferior had been the downfall of countless oppressors throughout history, and as he watched the cricket ruthlessly tear the life from its former master, an idea began to take shape in Scott's battle-scarred mind, an idea that could finally turn the tide against the Andromedan menace and secure humanity's place among the stars. The sound of shattering glass cut through the chaos like a plasma torch through hull plating. Scott drained the last dregs of his drink, slamming the empty glass onto the bar. The stool screeched across the metal floor as he stood, echoing the dying shrieks of the Andromedan. Scott strode toward the gory scene, his heavy boots crunching on fragments of the alien's shattered exoskeleton. The cricket still thrashed, ripping and tearing at Thule's mangled thorax. In a flash of movement, Scott drew his wicked-looking combat knife from his belt. The blade glinted in the dim light as he buried it to the hilt in the cricket's neck. The beast went rigid, then slumped to the ground, its razor-sharp fangs still embedded in the Andromedan's ruined flesh. Scott planted a boot on the cricket's muscular flank and wrenched his blade free. Alien blood sizzled as it dripped from the plasma-forged edge. Thal lay still, his multiple eyes dulled in death, the arrogance that had been his downfall now forever extinguished. Scott wiped the knife clean on the Andromedan's leathery hide, then resheathed it with a practiced motion. He looked around at the wide-eyed onlookers, humans and aliens alike frozen in shock. "What?" Scott growled, his voice rough as gravel. "You all just gonna stand there gawking?" As if released from a spell, the bar patrons hurriedly returned to their drinks, studiously avoiding eye contact with the blood-spattered human. The normal buzz of conversation slowly resumed, though decidedly more subdued. Scott turned to head back to his stool, but paused. He reached down and unclipped the leash from the dead cricket's collar. Gathering up the end of the leash, he coiled it loosely in one hand. With the other, he grabbed hold of the cricket's haunches. With a grunt of effort, Scott slung the creature's carcass up and over his broad shoulders. Green blood oozed down his back, mingling with the red of Thule's. The Marine turned and strode toward the exit, his grisly burden drawing shocked mutters from the crowd. At the door, Scott paused again and looked back over his shoulder. His eyes glinted in the dim light, cold and assessing. "Next round's on him," he rasped, jerking his chin toward Thule's crumpled corpse. Then he was gone, vanishing into the station's shadowy corridors with the cricket carcass in tow, leaving a trail of mingled human and alien blood in his wake. The harsh white light of the makeshift dissection lamp cast eerie shadows across Scott's quarters as he worked, the silence broken only by the occasional clink of surgical instruments and the soft squelch of alien flesh. The cricket's carcass lay before him, splayed open like a gruesome biology experiment. Scott's hands moved with practiced precision, separating each organ and cataloguing them with a detached efficiency born of years spent elbow-deep in the gore of the battlefield. He paused, holding up the cricket's heart. The organ was massive, easily twice the size of a human heart, and still marbled with the green blood of the Andromedan it had so recently been tearing apart. Scott turned it over in his hands, marveling at the dense, fibrous tissue. Memories of a distant swamp and an old reptilian comrade flickered through his mind. He set the heart aside, reaching for a scalpel. In his mind's eye, he was transported back to that fetid moon, crouched over a wounded soldier as Drogar loomed above them, his iridescent scales shimmering in the swamp's eerie bioluminescence. "Their strength is in their hearts, Sissi," the reptilian had hissed, pointing a clawed finger at the fallen Andromedan war beast, its chest cavity cracked open like a shattered exoskeleton. "The sis stronger the heart, the sis stronger the monster." Scott had dismissed it then, just another cryptic alien superstition from the inscrutable lizard. But now, with the cricket's massive heart before him, he wondered if Drogar had been onto something after all. With careful, precise movements, Scott began to excise the heart's tough outer layer, revealing the dense muscle tissue within. He extracted a small sample, placing it under the battered microscope that had seen him through countless field surgeries and hasty autopsies. What he saw made him pause, a small sound of surprise escaping his lips. The cricket's cellular structure was unlike anything he'd encountered before, dense and fibrous, yes, but also strangely pliable. It was almost as if the cells were designed to absorb and redirect energy, rather than simply contracting and expanding like human heart tissue. Scott leaned back, his mind racing with the implications. If he could find a way to synthesize this tissue, to somehow graft it onto a human heart, the possibilities were both exhilarating and terrifying. Super soldiers with the strength and endurance of an Andromedan war beast. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for a syringe, a plan already forming in his mind. He could see it now, the experiments, the trials, the inevitable failures, but also the potential for success. The syringe glinted under the harsh light as Scott held it up, his eyes reflecting the same cold determination that had seen him through countless battles and impossible odds. The harsh buzz of the door chime shattered the silence of Scott's quarters, jolting him from his musings. He glanced down at his hands one last time before rising, rolling down his sleeves to conceal the fading injection marks. The door slid open, revealing a stone-faced young ensign standing at rigid attention. "Sergeant Johnson, sir. Your presence is requested in the command center, immediately." The ensign spun on his heel, setting a brisk pace through the station's stark utilitarian corridors. Scott followed, his mind racing. Had they discovered his experiments, the unauthorized use of station resources, or worse, the true nature of his research? The command center doors hissed open, revealing Admiral Zevon waiting for him, his weathered face set in a deep scowl. 2 MPs flanked him, their postures rigid and their eyes cold. "Johnson," Zevon barked, his voice sharp as a plasma blade. "We've received some disturbing reports about your recent activities." Zevon slammed a meaty fist down on the conference table, making the holographic displays flicker. "Damn it, man. You've been AWOL for weeks, holed up in that rat's nest you call quarters, and now we find out you're conducting illegal experiments? Xenografting? Gene splicing?" The Admiral's face was turning an alarming shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging. "You better have a damn good explanation for this, soldier." Scott remained silent, his posture unwavering. Zevon glared at him, his eyes narrowing to slits. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Finally, Scott moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small cylindrical object. He placed it on the table, the soft clink of glass on metal echoing in the sudden silence. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the vial rolling across the polished surface. It came to rest in front of Zevon, the viscous, crimson liquid within sloshing gently. The Admiral snatched it up, holding it to the light. His brow furrowed as he squinted at the contents, suspicion etched into every line of his face. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "The future," Scott replied, his tone flat and even. "That's cricket heart tissue grafted onto human stem cells. I injected it into my own heart a week ago." Zavon's eyes widened, his grip on the vial tightening. "You did what?" Scott nodded, a single sharp jerk of his chin. "I'm stronger, faster, more resilient. I don't tire, I don't get winded. And my wounds—" He shrugged off his jacket, revealing a puckered scar on his left bicep. The angry red tissue stood out in stark contrast to his pale skin, but despite its fresh appearance, it already looked weeks old. Zavon looked down at the vial in his hand, then back at Scott. The Admiral's face was unreadable, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes. Fear. Anticipation. Scott leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Think about it, Admiral. An army of super soldiers with the strength and endurance of an Andromedan war beast. We could turn the tide of this war." Zavon was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. Then slowly he nodded. "It's all right, Johnson. You've got my attention. But this stays off the books, you understand. Top secret, need to know only." Scott nodded curtly. "Understood, sir." Zavon rose, pocketing the vial. "I'll be in touch. In the meantime, keep up the good work, but be careful. We're treading on thin ice here." With that, the Admiral strode out, the MPs falling into step behind him. The door hissed shut, leaving Scott alone in the command center. The dim light of the xenographed lab flickered, casting an eerie glow over the rows of tanks. Scott stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the still form of Private Jameson, now shrouded beneath a stark white sheet. The weight of what had just transpired pressed down on him, as heavy as the silence that now filled the room. With a shuddering breath, Scott tore his gaze away from Jameson's tank. He turned, his footsteps echoing hollowly, as he made his way back to where Corporal Durand floated, oblivious to the horror that had just unfolded. Scott paused, his hand resting on the cool glass of her tank. The steady beep of her monitor filled his ears, a mocking reminder of the life that had just been lost. He looked down at the datapad in his hand, the green glow of Durand's vitals burning into his retinas. All stable, all normal, as if nothing had happened, as if a young man hadn't just died, his body broken and bleeding on the cold, sterile floor. Scott's grip tightened on the datapad, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to scream, to rage at the injustice of it all, but he couldn't. He had a job to do, a duty to fulfill. He forced himself to look at Durand, to really see her. Her face was serene, her features softened by the gentle floating of her dark hair. She looked peaceful, untroubled, unaware of the sacrifice that had just been made in the name of progress. Scott's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. How many more would have to die before they achieved their goal? How much blood would stain his hands before it was over? He shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. He couldn't afford to dwell on it, not now, not when they were so close. Scott turned, his gaze sweeping over the rows of tanks, each one holding a volunteer, a brave soul who had agreed to give their body, their very life, to the cause. They knew the risks. They knew what they were signing up for. Scott's eyes fell on the young private's tank, now dark and empty. A life cut short, a sacrifice made, but not in vain, never in vain. With a deep breath, Scott straightened his shoulders. He had work to do. Durand's vitals needed monitoring. Adjustments needed to be made. The other volunteers needed to be checked, their progress tracked. He couldn't let Jameson's death be for nothing. He had to push forward to see this through, no matter the cost. For the future of humanity. For the memory of those who had fallen. For Private Jameson. Soon they start to arrive. Soldiers, mercenaries, even a few desperate civilians, all clamoring for a chance at something more. They fill out the forms, sign the waivers, and submit to the battery of tests with a grim determination born of equal parts hope and desperation. Scott oversees it all, his face an impassive mask as he guides his team through the endless procession of surgeries and procedures. He watches as the volunteers are prepped, sedated, and lowered into the tanks, their bodies suspended in the viscous, nutrient-rich fluid. Some don't make it, of course. It's the nature of the beast, the price of progress. Scott stands over the bodies, his eyes distant as he catalogues each failure, each life lost in pursuit of this dark miracle. But the successes, they take his breath away. They emerge from the tanks reborn, their skin slick with the birthing fluid, their eyes blazing with an inhuman fire. They move with a fluid grace that defies belief, their muscles coiled with a raw, primal power. Scott watches as they train, marveling at their speed, their strength, their sheer unbridled ferocity. They tear through combat simulations like feral beasts, ripping through metal and flesh alike with a savagery that borders on the ecstatic. In the face of these xenographed warriors, the Andromedan warbeasts seem clumsy, almost laughable. Scott can't help but feel a fierce surge of pride as he watches his creations at work, the culmination of all his years of toil and sacrifice. But even as he revels in their power, a creeping sense of unease begins to grow in the back of his mind. The xenografts are changing, and not just physically. There's a coldness to them, a ruthless, predatory edge that wasn't there before. He sees it in the way they talk, the way they move, the way they look at the unaugmented humans around them. It's as if they're becoming something other, something less than human, or perhaps more. And then the reports start coming in, whispers of xenographs gone rogue, abandoning their posts and vanishing into the void of space. Some say they've gone in search of the Andromedans, drawn to them by some primal, irresistible urge. Others believe they've formed their own faction, a third power in this bloody interstellar dance. Scott doesn't know what to believe anymore. All he knows is that he's unleashed something he can no longer control, a force that could reshape the very fabric of the galaxy. Part of him wants to feel proud, to revel in the sheer, awe-inspiring magnitude of what he's accomplished. But another part, the part that still clings to his dwindling humanity, can't shake the gnawing sense of dread, the feeling that he's crossed a line from which there can be no return. But the die is cast, the Rubicon crossed. The xenographed warriors have been unleashed upon an unsuspecting universe for good or for ill, and Scott will be there to see it through, to bear witness to the bloody, bitter end he has wrought. The alarms blare, a piercing wail that cuts through the chatter on the bridge. The crew falls silent, their eyes wide as they turn to the view screens. There, against the starry backdrop of space, a massive fleet blinks into existence. Ships of every size and configuration, but all bearing the same markings, the twisted helix of the Andromedan Empire. "It's an invasion," someone whispers, their voice trembling. "A full-scale assault." The Admiral sets his jaw, his eyes hard as flint. He barks orders, his voice cutting through the rising panic. The human fleet mobilizes, ships peeling away from their orbits, weapon systems humming to life. They form up in a defensive line, a wall of steel and plasma between the Andromedans and the colony worlds they have sworn to protect. But it's not enough. The Andromedans have come prepared. Their ships are newer, sleeker, bristling with advanced weaponry, and at the heart of their fleet, a monstrous dreadnought looms, its hull so black it seems to swallow the very light around it. The battle is joined, and it is a slaughter. The Andromedan ships dart and weave, their movements almost graceful as they evade the human fleet's fire. And then they unleash their own weapons, a searing barrage of energy beams that rip through the human ships like paper. Hulls buckle, atmospheres vent into the void. Ships bloom into brief, brilliant novas as their reactors go critical. The screams of the dying fill the comms, a cacophony of terror and agony. On the bridge of the flagship, the Admiral grips the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. He watches the tactical display, the icons representing his ships winking out one by one. They can't win this, he realizes with a sinking certainty. The Andromedans are too strong, too advanced. The human fleet is being cut to ribbons. But there is one last hope, one final gambit. The Admiral turns to his comms officer, his voice low and urgent. "Initiate Operation Xenographed. Deploy the drop pods." In the bows of the ship, 1,000 pods stand ready, each one containing a single xenograft warrior. They are the last resort, the final weapon in humanity's arsenal. Augmented soldiers, grafted with the strength and ferocity of the cricket, the apex predators of the Andromedan's own conquered worlds. The pods launch, streaking towards the Andromedan dreadnought like a swarm of angry hornets. They punch through the ship's hull, tearing through metal and chitin alike. And then they disgorge their cargo, 1,000 xenograft warriors spilling into the heart of the enemy vessel. Among them is Scott, his eyes blazing with an inhuman fury. He leads the charge, a primal roar tearing from his throat as he plunges into the fray. His grafted heart pounds in his chest, a relentless war drum driving him forward. The xenografts tear through the Andromedan crew like a hurricane of blades and claws. They are unstoppable, indestructible, fueled by a rage that borders on madness. Andromedan blood paints the corridors, pooling in slick, iridescent puddles. The air rings with the shrieks of the dying, a hellish chorus that echoes through the ship. But as the last Andromedan falls, a chilling laugh cuts through the din. Scott freezes, his blood running cold. He knows that sound, remembers it from his darkest nightmares. Thule steps out from the shadows, his exoskeleton gleaming in the emergency lights. He is monstrous, towering over even the largest xenograft. His carapace is thick, his claws viciously barbed, and there, embedded in his chest, a pulsing mass of red flesh, a cricket heart grafted into his very body. "Surprised, human?" Thule hisses, his mandibles clicking in cruel amusement. "Did you think you were the only ones with this power?" He stalks forward, his movements fluid and predatory. "We have been watching you, learning from you. Your little xenograft project was impressive, but flawed, incomplete." Thule taps a claw against his chest, against the abomination of flesh and chitin that beats there. "We have perfected the process, made it our own, and now we will show you what true power looks like." He lunges blindingly fast, his claws slashing for Scott's throat. Scott meets him head-on, his combat knife flashing in the dim light. They clash in a whirlwind of steel and chitin, human and Andromedan locked in a battle that will decide the fate of the galaxy. Scott can feel the strength coursing through his veins, the power of the cricket heart driving him beyond the limits of human endurance. But Thule is stronger still, his augmented body fueled by a savage, alien ferocity. They trade blows in a deadly dance, claws raking against combat armor, knife blades sparking off chitin. Around them, the xenograft warriors battle on, locked in their own desperate struggles against the remaining Andromedan forces. But Scott barely notices, his entire being focused on the monster before him. Thule is fast, strong, a perfect fusion of Andromedan cunning and cricket savagery. And yet, there is something more, an intelligence burning behind those multifaceted eyes, a cruel amusement in the curl of his mandibles. "You cannot win, human," Thule taunts, his voice a grating rasp. "We are the superior species, the rightful rulers of this galaxy. And now, with the power of the xenografts, we are unstoppable." His claw lashes out, a blur of chitin and barbed edges. It catches Scott across the chest, tearing through his armor like paper. Hot blood runs down his front, a searing agony that steals the breath from his lungs. Scott staggers back, his hand pressed to the wound. He can feel his grafted heart laboring, pumping with a desperate fury to keep him alive. But Thule is relentless, pressing his advantage with a flurry of blows that drive Scott to his knees. But Scott is not finished, not yet. With a roar of defiance, he surges to his feet, his knife flashing up in a desperate arc. The blade finds the gap in Thule's armor, sinking deep into the pulsing mass of the cricket heart. Thule staggers back, a shriek of agony tearing from his throat. Iridescent blood spurts from the wound, splattering Scott's face and chest. The Andromedan wavers, his claws scrabbling at the knife hilt protruding from his chest. Scott presses forward, his own heart pounding with a savage triumph. He rips the knife free in a spray of gore, and then plunges it back in again and again until Thule's shrieks fade to wet, gurgling gasps. The Andromedan collapses, his carapace dulling as the life drains from him. Scott stands over him, chest heaving, blood dripping from his blade. Around him the sounds of battle are fading, the xenographed warriors emerging victorious from their own fights. But the taste of triumph is bitter on Scott's tongue. He looks down at Thul's corpse, at the abomination grafted into his chest. Is this what they have become? Monsters, fused with the flesh of their enemies, driven by a hunger for violence and domination. He doesn't have the answers. All he knows is that the war is far from over. The Andromedans will return with new weapons and new horrors, and humanity will meet them on the bloody edge of the xenograft's blades. Scott turns away, his steps heavy as he makes his way back to the waiting drop pods. The battle is won, but at what cost? Only time will tell. The clash of titans shook the very foundations of the ship, the screeching of metal on chitin, eclipsed only by the primal roars of the combatants. Scott and Thul whirled in a deadly dance, their augmented bodies pushed to the limits of their newfound capabilities. Scott's fists pounded against Thul's exoskeleton, each blow resonating with a sickening crunch. But the Andromedan warlord barely flinched, his own claws raking across Scott's flesh, leaving deep, oozing gashes in their wake. It was becoming painfully clear that Thul was the superior specimen. His movements were swifter, his blows more powerful. The Andromedan xenograft process, refined over countless cycles, had created a being of unparalleled might. Scott's heart hammered in his chest, the cricket tissue pulsing with a desperate fury. He was outmatched and he knew it, but he refused to yield, refused to let this abomination triumph. With a roar of defiance, Scott launched himself at Thule, feinting left before pivoting right. His fist slammed into the warlord's chest, directly over the pulsing mass of the grafted cricket heart. But then Thule laughed, a grating, hideous sound that echoed through the chamber. "Is that all, human?" he sneered, ichor dripping from his mandibles. "Is that the best you can do?" The warlord surged forward, his claws wrapping around Scott's throat. He lifted the human off his feet, squeezing, crushing. Scott gasped, his lungs screaming for air, his vision blurring at the edges. This was it, he realized. This was how it would end. Strangled by a monster of his own making aboard an alien ship light years from home. A fitting end, perhaps, for the man who had dared to play God. But even as the darkness closed in, Scott saw something. A flicker of movement, a glint of metal. Corporal Durand, his most promising xenograft, was creeping up behind Thul, a long, wicked-looking blade in her hand. Their eyes met, and in that instant an understanding passed between them, a plan born of desperation and the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of war. The warlord howled, a sound of pure agony and rage. He released Scott, his claws scrabbling at the wound, trying frantically to dislodge the blade, but it was too late. The heart, the source of his terrible power, had been pierced. Ichor thick and viscous poured from the wound. Thule staggered, his legs giving way beneath him. He fell to his knees, his multifaceted eyes already clouding over. "How?" he rasped, his voice a fading whisper. "How could mere humans defeat me?" Scott looked down at the dying warlord, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "That's the thing about humans," he said. "We're not just strong, we're stubborn as hell. And we never, ever give up." With a final shudder, Thul collapsed, his exoskeleton clattering against the deck. The Andromedan warlord, the scourge of 100 systems, was dead. Around them, the tide of battle was turning. The human fleets, rallied by the xenograft's victory, pressed their advantage. The Andromedan ships, leaderless and demoralized, were routed, driven back into the void. The war would go on, a never-ending cycle of destruction and rebirth, and the xenografts, the living weapons he had created, would be at the forefront of it all. It was a terrible burden, a crushing responsibility, but it was one Scott knew he must bear. For the sake of humanity, for the sake of all those who would come after, he would see this through, no matter the cost. The cheers of the crowd are deafening as Scott and his xenograft warriors step out onto the stage. Ticker tape rains down, catching in their hair and sticking to their sweat-drenched skin. The sea of faces stretches out before them, a writhing mass of adoration and gratitude. But to Scott it all feels hollow, empty. He forces a smile, waves mechanically at the crowd. Beside him, his xenografts do the same, their movements stiff and robotic. The light in their eyes, once so fierce and alive, has dimmed. They are shells, going through the motions, the horrors they've endured etched into every line of their faces. Scott's gaze drifts over the crowd, not really seeing them. Instead, he sees the faces of the fallen. Private Jameson, his body broken and bleeding on the cold floor of the xenograft lab. Corporal Durand, her life snuffed out in a blaze of Andromedan plasma fire. So many others, too many to count, all sacrificed in the name of his grand vision. The weight of it all presses down on him, threatening to crush him. He wants to scream, to tear at his hair, to fall to his knees, and beg forgiveness. But he can't. He is a hero now, a savior of humanity. He must play the part, even as it kills him inside. The days blur together, a never-ending parade of celebration and adulation. Medals are pinned to his chest, hands are shaken, speeches are made. Through it all, Scott feels numb, disconnected. He moves through the world like a ghost, a spectre haunting his own life. And then, the whispers begin. Rumors at first easily dismissed, but they grow louder, more insistent. Xenografts going rogue, their grafted alien tissues mutating, taking over. They become monsters, twisted parodies of the heroes they once were. They lash out, indiscriminate in their violence, leaving a trail of broken bodies in their wake. The public turns on them, fear and hatred replacing the love and gratitude. Xenografts are hunted down, gunned down in the streets like rabid dogs. Those that survive are driven into hiding, forced to live in the shadows. Scott watches it all unfold, helpless to stop it. He knows he should do something, should stand up for his creations, but he is tired, so tired. The fight has gone out of him, leached away by the endless parade of death and destruction. And so in the end he simply disappears. He walks away from it all, vanishing into the vast, uncaring expanse of the galaxy. He becomes a ghost, a half-remembered legend whispered about in seedy spaceport bars and darkened alleyways. Years pass, decades. The war ends, the galaxy moves on. The xenografts, those few that remain, are forgotten, consigned to the footnotes of history. Humanity rebuilds, content in its mediocrity, never knowing how close it came to true greatness. And Scott? He drifts, a shadow of his former self. He loses himself in drink, in cheap thrills and cheaper companionship. He tries to forget, to lose himself in the vastness of space. But always, the memories haunt him, the faces of the dead forever etched into his mind. In the end, as he lies on his deathbed, a broken old man ravaged by time and regret, he looks out at the stars one last time. He thinks of what might have been, of the glories that could have been. If only humanity had been ready, if only they had been strong enough to grasp the future he had offered them. But they weren't, and now it is too late. The dream is dead, buried with the countless xenografts who gave their lives for a cause that was doomed from the start. Scott's eyes drift closed, his breath rattling in his chest. He welcomes the darkness, the release from his pain. But even as he slips away, a final thought flickers through his fading mind. Out there, somewhere, a single xenograft still lives. A last remnant of his legacy, carrying the torch of his vision into the future. It is a fool's hope, he knows. The universe is cold and cruel, and the dreams of men are fragile things. But still, he clings to it, a final defiance in the face of oblivion. And then he is gone. His body grows still, his labored breathing fading into silence. The machines that have kept him alive for so long beep once, twice, and then fall silent. The room is still, the only sound the soft hum of the life support systems cycling down. Outside, the stars wheel overhead, vast and indifferent. They do not note the passing of Scott Johnson, the man who dared to dream. His death, like his life, is a small thing, a flicker in the cosmos, there and gone in an instant. And the galaxy spins on unchanged and uncaring. The xenograph project fades into memory, a footnote in the annals of history. Humanity continues on its petty course, squabbling over the scraps of the universe, never knowing how close it came to true greatness. It is a bitter end, a testament to the folly of hubris and the price of reaching too far. But perhaps in some strange way, it is fitting. For what is the fate of all pioneers, all those who dare to push the boundaries of what is possible? They burn bright for a moment and then they are gone, consumed by the very forces they sought to master, and the universe, vast and indifferent, hardly notes there. In the eons that follow, the galaxy is a changed place. The old powers once so dominant fade into obscurity. The Andromedan Empire, a mere husk of its former glory, crumbles under the weight of centuries, its once mighty fleets reduced to rusting hulks drifting aimlessly through the void. New civilizations rise from the ashes of the old, their eyes filled with the fire of ambition. They look upon the stars as a frontier to be conquered, a canvas upon which to paint their destiny. They build vast cities that pierce the heavens, construct fleets that darken the skies. In their hubris they believe themselves invincible. But in the shadowed corners of seedy spaceport bars, in the hushed whispers of ancient sages, the stories persist. Tales of a forgotten age, of a terror that once stalked the stars. The xenographs. Most dismiss these stories as mere legend, the ramblings of superstitious fools. The very idea of such beings, part flesh, part machine, seems the stuff of fevered dreams and madness. But a few know better. They have seen the signs, stumbled upon the scattered remnants of that bygone era, a derelict laboratory drifting in the cold depths of space, a scrap of alien technology, pulsing with an eerie, unworldly light. And sometimes, just sometimes, a fleeting glimpse of something that shouldn't be, a shadow that moves too quickly, a figure that vanishes when looked at directly. These believers live in constant fear, their eyes forever scanning the horizon for the day their nightmares become reality. They know that the xenographs are not gone, but merely waiting, biding their time in some far-flung corner of the galaxy, growing stronger, evolving into something new and terrible. And they know that when the xenographs return, it will be as a plague upon the stars. They will sweep across the galaxy, an unstoppable tide of destruction, leaving naught but ashes and echoes in their wake. The new civilizations, for all their pride and power, will be as leaves before a hurricane. They will fight, oh yes, but it will be a futile struggle. There will be no great heroes, no 11th-hour miracles, only the cold certainty of the end. And as the lights of a trillion worlds flicker and fade, as the last bastions of life and hope crumble into dust, the survivors will gather in the darkness and whisper the old stories to one another, stories of the xenographs and of the man who created them. Scott Johnson will be remembered not as a visionary, but as a harbinger of doom, the architect of humanity's downfall. In those final days, as the universe itself grows cold and silent, the bitter truth will be known. Humanity's reach exceeded its grasp, and in striving for the heavens, they brought only hell. The xenographs were the price of their ambition, the inevitable consequence of their hubris, a fitting epitaph for a species that dared to play God. And so the story will end, not with a defiant roar, but with a whimper, a last gasping breath in the endless night. The xenographs will inherit the ruins of a galaxy, striding through the bones of fallen civilizations. Their legacy will be one of terror and destruction, a warning. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.